The elegant hush of Manhattan Grand Bistro was shattered by a desperate voice. "Don't eat that!" The words sliced through the air, freezing conversations and clinking silverware. Elijah Carter, billionaire and business mogul, sat at his private table, his spoon hovering inches above a steaming bowl of lobster bisque. Across from him, his stunning young wife, Vivienne, exuded polished grace, until that moment. Every head turned toward the source of the outburst, a black homeless boy, Jaden, standing at the entrance, his face pale with urgency. Security rushed toward him, ready to drag him away. Vivienne's voice cut through the chaos, cold and controlled. "Who let this filth in here?" Elijah, still motionless, looked from the boy to his wife. His hand trembled. The spoon dipped closer to his lips. What if the boy was telling the truth? Jaden's stomach twisted in painful knots as he trudged through the cold streets of New York, his thin hoodie barely shielding him from the biting wind. He had spent another night under the bridge, curled up on flattened cardboard, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the occasional shouts of drunks passing by. Hunger gnawed at him, relentless and unforgiving. He had learned to ignore it, to push it aside like an unwelcome guest. But today, it was unbearable. His last meal had been 2 days ago. Half a discarded sandwich he had fished out of a trash can before a security guard chased him off. His hands were numb as he reached into his pocket, feeling the small collection of coins he had managed to scavenge. It wasn't much, but maybe, just maybe, it was enough to buy a sandwich. Hope flickered. Inside him, fragile but alive, he made his way toward a deli on the corner, a place he had passed by 100 times, always watching from the outside, always wondering what the warm bread and fresh meat tasted like. Swallowing his hesitation, he stepped inside, the sudden warmth making his fingers sting as the blood rushed back into them. The air smelled of toasted bread and sizzling bacon, making his stomach growl loudly. Heads turned. A few customers wrinkled their noses, shifting away as if his very presence was an offense. The cashier, a middle-aged white man with a thick mustache, eyed him with immediate suspicion. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice flat, uninterested. Jaden hesitated, then placed his coins on the counter. "A sandwich, please, just a small one." The cashier's eyes flicked down to the coins, then back up to Jaden. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "We don't serve thieves," he said, sweeping the coins off the counter and into the trash. Jaden's breath caught in his throat. I'm not a thief. I have money." His voice was barely above a whisper, but it didn't matter. The cashier waved toward the door. "Get out." Heat rushed to Jaden's face, humiliation burning through him. He wanted to argue, to demand his money back, but he knew how this would go. He had seen it before, had felt it before. The way people looked at him, a homeless black boy, as if he were already guilty of something. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had done nothing wrong. And yet, here he was, treated like dirt, like less than nothing. The customers around him didn't say a word. No one defended him. No one even looked at him. He turned, walking toward the door, but before he could step outside, a large hand landed on his shoulder. His body tensed. A uniformed security guard towered over him, his expression unreadable. "You heard the man," the guard said, steering Jaden toward the exit with a rough shove. "And don't come back." Jaden stumbled forward, barely catching himself before falling onto the icy sidewalk. Behind him, laughter erupted from inside the deli. Shame curled in his gut like a living thing, choking him. He wanted to scream, to fight, but he knew better. Instead, he walked away, fists clenched, shoulders hunched against the cold, his stomach aching not just from hunger but from the familiar weight of injustice. He wandered the streets, avoiding the glances of passing pedestrians, who either ignored him or looked at him with thinly veiled disgust. He had learned long ago that the world didn't care about boys like him. It only cared about keeping them in their place. Hours passed. The hunger clawed at him, relentless. He found himself near Manhattan Grand Bistro, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. He had never dared come this close before, But today, he didn't care. The smell of rich food made his mouth water. He lingered near the alleyway behind the building, hoping to find something, anything that could pass for a meal. That was when he saw her, Vivienne Carter. She stepped out onto the back patio, her designer heels clicking against the stone floor, a small vial clutched between her fingers. Jaden froze, watching as she walked toward a table where a waiter had just placed a steaming bowl of lobster. Bisque. The moment was so casual, so effortless that at first, Jaden thought he must be imagining it. But then, he saw her tilt the vial, saw the clear liquid disappear into the soup. His pulse thundered in his ears. What had he just witnessed? He wasn't stupid. He knew what poison looked like. His mother had once warned him to never take food from strangers on the streets. She had told him horror stories about people being drugged, about things that could kill without a trace. Was she poisoning the food? His stomach turned. He looked around, expecting someone, anyone, to notice, but no one did. The waiters bustled about, the patrons sipped their wine, oblivious. And then Vivienne leaned in toward the man sitting across from her. The same man from the newspapers, the same man who owned half the city. Elijah Carter. Jaden saw her lips move, but he couldn't hear what she said. He only saw the look in her eyes, cold, calculating. He swallowed hard. What should he do? Should he walk away? Should he pretend he hadn't seen it? Who would believe him? A homeless kid accusing one of the richest women in the city. He could already hear the laughter, the way they would dismiss him. They would say he was crazy, desperate for attention. But if he said nothing, if he let this happen, Elijah Carter was going to die. His body moved before his brain could stop him. He pushed off the alley wall, rushing toward the restaurant's entrance. The warmth of the inside hit him like a wall, but he didn't stop. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he shoved past startled patrons, his voice rising above the din. "Don't eat that!" The room froze. The conversations died. Every eye turned toward him. Security was already moving. A hand grabbed his arm, yanking him back, but he fought. "She put something in your food," he shouted, locking eyes with Elijah. "I saw her." Would Elijah believe him? Or would this be the moment where the world once again turned its back on a boy like him? Comment number 1 if you believe Jaden should be heard. Do you think Elijah will trust him, or will he dismiss him like everyone else? Like, subscribe, and stay tuned. Jaden's heart pounded so hard it felt like it might break through his ribs as security yanked him back, their grips tight around his thin arms. The entire restaurant had gone silent, all eyes locked on the wild-looking homeless kid who had just barged in and screamed at a billionaire. Jaden struggled, twisting against their hold, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but they didn't let go. Across the room, Elijah Carter sat frozen, his spoon hovering above the steaming bowl of lobster bisque, his sharp gray eyes flicking from Jaden to his wife, then back to the trembling soup. Vivienne was already standing, her chair scraping loudly against the polished marble floor, her face an unreadable mask of irritation and barely concealed fury. "This is absurd," she snapped, smoothing down the fabric of her silk dress as if this entire ordeal was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "Get this little rat out of here." Jaden struggled harder, desperation burning through him. "She put something in your soup," he shouted again, his voice cracking under the weight of urgency. "I saw her. A bottle. Clear liquid. She poured it in when you weren't looking." His words felt like they should have changed something, but they didn't. The restaurant remained still, the patrons watching with a mixture of amusement, discomfort, and skepticism. A few whispered to each other, shaking their heads. A homeless kid, dirty and desperate, causing a scene in a place where he didn't belong. It was nothing new to them. The security guards were already moving, dragging him toward the entrance. Jaden kicked, panic rising like bile in his throat. "I'm not lying, smell it, just smell it," he yelled, his voice hoarse. Elijah's brow furrowed slightly, and for a moment, his hand hesitated over the bowl. But then Vivienne let out a sharp, forced laugh, flipping her golden hair over her shoulder, as she shot her husband a look of pure exasperation. "Oh, for God's sake, Elijah. Are you really going to entertain this nonsense? She asked, her voice dripping with condescension. Look at him, he's just trying to cause trouble. Probably wants money. Jaden's stomach churned at the way she said it, the ease with which she dismissed him like he was nothing, like he didn't even matter. He had heard that tone before, felt that rejection before. No one ever believed him. No one ever listened. But he couldn't give up. Not now. I saw you, he snarled, eyes locking onto Vivienne with a fury that surprised even him. I saw what you did. I know what you are. Her mask of patience cracked for a fraction of a second. Something flickered in her eyes. Something cold and dark. But then it was gone, replaced with that same effortless poise. Enough, she said, her voice a whip crack of authority. Throw him out. The guards yanked Jaden harder, dragging him toward the exit, his sneakers screeching against the tile. He thrashed, rage and terror mixing into something blinding. No! No, you have to believe me, he begged, his voice raw. He twisted his head toward Elijah one last time, locking eyes with him, forcing all of his desperation into his voice. If you eat that, you'll die. The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. Elijah didn't move. His spoon still hovered, his lips pressed into a thin, unreadable line. But his eyes, his sharp, calculating eyes, were fixed on Jaden, studying. Him reading him the way a man like him read stock markets and business deals. And then, slowly, he lowered the spoon back into the bowl. Let him go, Elijah said, his voice quiet but firm. The guards froze. Vivienne's head snapped toward him, her perfectly painted lips parting in surprise. What? She asked, the single word sharper than glass. Elijah ignored her. His gaze remained on Jaden, searching, weighing. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers steepling together in front of him. Tell me exactly what you saw, he said. Jaden stumbled forward as the guards released him, his knees weak, his pulse still hammering in his ears. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry as he tried to find the right words, to make Elijah understand. She took something out of her purse, he said, voice still shaking but steadying now that someone, finally, was listening. A small bottle. I saw her twist the cap off. She poured it into your soup when you weren't looking. Then she stirred it in with the spoon. He turned to Vivienne, his hands curling into fists at his sides. And then she said, After all the trouble I've gone through, you won't ruin this now. Elijah's gaze flickered toward his wife, unreadable. Vivienne scoffed, rolling her eyes. Oh, come on, Elijah, this is ridiculous, she said, shaking her head, her tone shifting from irritation to light amusement, as if this was all some big joke. Are you really going to believe the word of some filthy street kid over your own wife? A murmur rippled through the restaurant. Some of the patrons were watching closely now, their curiosity piqued. A few whispered to each other, their gazes bouncing between Vivienne and Elijah. Elijah exhaled slowly, then reached for the spoon, again. But this time, instead of bringing it to his lips, he lifted it toward his nose. His expression didn't change, but Jaden saw it. The way his shoulders tensed, the way his jaw tightened just slightly. He set the spoon down with deliberate slowness. Vivienne, he said, his voice measured, what exactly is in this? Vivienne didn't answer right away. She hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. The room seemed to close in on itself, the air thick with something unspoken. Then, with a soft, breathy laugh, she placed a delicate hand on her chest. Oh, don't be absurd, she said, shaking her head as she looked around at the watching crowd. You're embarrassing yourself, Elijah. But Elijah wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at the soup. His fingers drummed against the table, slow and thoughtful. Then, in one swift motion, he grabbed his napkin and tossed it over the bowl. We'll have it tested, he said simply. Vivienne's face paled. Excuse me? Elijah's gaze lifted to hers, and for the first time that night there was something dangerous in it. We'll have the soup tested, he repeated, his voice cool and sharp. If there's nothing in it, you'll have nothing to worry about. Vivienne's mouth opened and closed once, twice. but no sound came out. The color drained from her face, and for the first time since Jaden had burst in, she looked afraid. Not furious, not amused. Afraid. Elijah leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes still on her. "Unless, of course," he said, tilting his head slightly, "you have a reason to be worried." The restaurant was utterly silent. Every patron, every waiter, every single person in that room was holding their breath. Jaden stood frozen, watching, waiting. And then, finally, Vivienne's mask shattered. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her glass of wine, but she didn't lift it. She only gripped it, her knuckles white. Her perfect, polished exterior was cracking, revealing something raw and frantic underneath. Elijah's lips pressed into a thin line. His fingers tapped against the table one last time before he exhaled sharply, then turned to the head waiter. "Call the police," he said. The words hit the room like a gunshot. Vivienne sucked in a sharp breath. "No," she said, her voice suddenly small, suddenly panicked. "Elijah, wait!" But he wasn't listening. The waiter nodded and disappeared into the kitchen. The tension in the room was suffocating now, a silent storm ready to break. Vivienne's hands clenched against the tablecloth, her chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. And Jaden just stood there, staring at her, at the woman who had tried to kill her husband in broad daylight. She turned her head, slightly, her blue eyes locking onto his with something venomous, something full of pure, unfiltered hate. And Jaden knew in that moment that this wasn't over. Not yet. The weight of Elijah's words, "Call the police," seemed to hang in the air like a guillotine blade poised to drop. The elegant restaurant, once filled with the murmur of the city's elite enjoying their expensive meals, was now suffocatingly silent, every eye darting between Elijah, his wife Vivienne, and the trembling black boy who had just turned the entire evening upside down. Jaden stood frozen, his hands still clenched into fists at his sides, watching as Vivienne's expression transformed from controlled panic into something far more dangerous, something cold, calculating, and desperate. She wasn't going to let this go, not without a fight. The waiter who had rushed off to call the authorities had barely disappeared into the back before Vivienne snapped into action, her voice taking on a silky, venomous edge. "You're making a mistake, Elijah," she murmured, stepping closer, her manicured nails pressing against the tablecloth. "You know exactly what this looks like, don't you? A homeless boy, a known criminal type, probably looking for a quick payout, and you, my husband, a respected businessman, actually entertaining this nonsense." She turned sharply to Jaden, her blue eyes piercing, predatory. "Tell me, boy, how much did someone pay you to come in here and humiliate me? How much are they offering you to ruin my life?" Jaden flinched. The accusation wasn't just an attack. It was a lifeline, a perfectly crafted excuse for her to spin the entire situation in her favor. He knew how people like her worked. He had seen it before. A rich white woman playing the victim, twisting the truth, turning people against him before. He even had a chance to defend himself, and it was working. A few of the customers who had been staring at her with suspicion now exchanged glances, some nodding, some murmuring in agreement. He could feel the tide shifting, could see the way the whispers spread like wildfire. "She has a point," someone muttered. "These kids are always looking for trouble." "Exactly," another voice chimed in. "They do this all the time. Fake an accusation, cause a scene, and then hope for a payout." Jaden's chest tightened. No, this wasn't happening. Elijah, however, was still watching. He hadn't said anything yet. His fingers were pressed together, his expression unreadable. Jaden had to make him see. He had to make him believe. "I didn't do this for money," Jaden said, his voice hoarse, but firm. "I saw what she did. I don't want anything from you. I just didn't want you to die." His voice cracked at the last word. A flicker of something crossed Elijah's face. Doubt? Understanding? It was impossible to tell, but Vivienne's mask of patience was slipping fast. She knew she was running out of time. She turned to the guards. her voice dropping to a low, urgent hiss. "Get rid of him, now!" The guards hesitated. One of them cleared his throat. "Ma'am, your husband said to—" "I don't care what he said," she snapped, her composure shattering. "Throw him out." Jaden barely had time to react before the guards seized him again, yanking him toward the door. He struggled, kicking, twisting, trying to fight. "Elijah, please, you have to believe me." But before Elijah could respond, the front doors of the restaurant burst open. A flood of blue uniforms poured in, the dull gleam of police badges catching in the golden restaurant light. Jaden stilled. His blood ran cold. This wasn't good. The police officers moved fast, their presence commanding immediate attention. The customers sat up straighter, some adjusting their clothes as if trying to appear respectable. Jaden knew this look. He had seen it before. When cops showed up in a place like this, they weren't here to listen to a black homeless kid. They were here to protect people like Vivienne. A tall officer stepped forward, his gaze sweeping the room before settling. "On Elijah." "Sir, we received a call about a possible poisoning." His voice was calm, professional, but there was a sharpness to it, an edge of skepticism. "Yes," Elijah said, finally rising from his seat, his gaze unreadable as he gestured toward Gior, the untouched bowl of soup. "I need this tested immediately." The officer nodded, but before he could respond, Vivienne was already moving. "Officer," she interrupted smoothly, her voice shifting into something perfectly rehearsed, perfectly controlled. "The victimized wife, the wrongfully accused socialite. This is a complete misunderstanding." The officer turned to her, his brow furrowing slightly. "Ma'am, could you clarify?" Vivienne sighed dramatically, casting a quick glance at the stunned onlookers before shaking her head. "This boy," she said, pointing directly at Jaden, "barged in here screaming, accusing me of something unthinkable. And now, my husband is—" She forced a laugh, shaking her head as if this was all some ridiculous joke. "Well, you see how it looks, officer? My husband has always been a little too, trusting." Her eyes slid back to Jaden, cold as ice. "And this boy is just trying to take advantage of that." The moment the words left her mouth, Jaden felt it, the shift, the room turning against him. The officers' expressions hardened, their eyes flicking toward him, their hands inching closer. To their holsters. No, 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 no. He tried to step forward, but one of the officers grabbed his arm. "Is this true?" The officer's voice was sharp, the words biting. "Are you lying about this?" Jaden's throat went dry. He shook his head quickly, but the grip on his arm tightened. "You homeless kid?" another officer asked, his tone casual. But Jaden knew better. He could hear the warning in it. He had been in situations like this before. He had seen it happen to others. He knew what was coming next. "That doesn't matter," Jaden burst out, twisting toward Elijah. "You know I'm telling the truth. Just test the soup." Elijah didn't respond right away. He studied Jaden, studied his wife, studied the officers. The whole room seemed to be holding its breath. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Elijah turned back to the lead officer. His voice was calm, deliberate. "Do the test." The tension in the room snapped like a taut wire. Vivienne whirled on Elijah, her composure completely crumbling. "Elijah, are you serious? You're actually listening to this street rat?" But Elijah wasn't looking at her anymore. His gaze remained on the officer. "I want it tested," he repeated. "And until we get the results, no one eats the soup." The lead officer hesitated, then gave a short nod. One of the other officers stepped forward, carefully lifting the bowl. Vivienne's breathing was erratic now. Jaden could see it. The cracks in her perfect mask, the panic seeping through. She wasn't just angry anymore. She was afraid. The officer holding the bowl turned to her. "Ma'am, if there's nothing in here, you have nothing to worry about." Vivienne's lips parted. For the first time, she didn't seem to have an answer. Jaden's stomach churned as he watched her, waiting. Was this it? Would the truth finally come out? Or would she find a way to twist things in her favor yet again? Comment number 1 if you think Vivienne's lies are falling apart. Do you believe the test will prove Jaden right? Or will Vivienne find a way out of this? Like, subscribe, and stay tuned. The silence in the restaurant was unbearable as the officer carefully lifted the bowl of soup, his expression unreadable as he signaled another officer to secure it for testing. The weight of the moment pressed against everyone in the room, the collective anticipation thick enough to choke on. Jaden could feel his own pulse hammering in his ears, his body still tense from the grip of security only moments before. His throat was raw, his limbs shaking, but he hadn't lost yet. He had made Elijah listen. That was more than he could have hoped for. But Vivienne was still fighting. Her blue eyes burned with something beyond fury now, something dark and desperate. Her nails dug into her palms as she took a single step toward Elijah, lowering her voice to something smooth and familiar, the same tone she had likely used in all of their social circles, in all of their polished high society. Lies. Elijah, she murmured, her voice dripping with forced patience as though she were speaking to a child who didn't understand the game. You know this is ridiculous. You know exactly how this looks. She flicked her gaze toward the officers, toward the onlookers still pretending not to eavesdrop. A respected businessman questioning his wife over the word of a... She hesitated just long enough for the word homeless to sink in before shaking her head, feigning exhaustion. This is humiliating. You're letting him manipulate you. Elijah didn't move. He didn't even blink. If anything, his posture remained as infuriatingly composed as it had been from the moment Jaden had shouted his warning, but now there was something else beneath it, a sharpness, a calculation that sent Vivienne's carefully constructed reality spiraling further out of her control. She knew it. Jaden knew it. Then you have nothing to worry about, do you? Elijah finally said, his voice so smooth, so deceptively. Calm that for the first time, Vivienne faltered. Her lips parted slightly, and for a fleeting second, Jaden saw the cracks, a flicker of uncertainty, a second of realization that things were slipping. She was losing control of the narrative. She recovered quickly, rolling her shoulders back, straightening her posture. But Elijah had seen it. Jaden had seen it. And for the first time, the tables were turning. This is absurd, she snapped, her tone turning colder, sharper, something a little too close to panic laced in her otherwise impeccable delivery. How dare you? You're seriously entertaining the word of a dirty, lying street kid over your eye. Own wife? Elijah, I have stood by you through everything. I have done everything for you, and this is how you repay me? Elijah sighed, not in exasperation, not in disbelief, in something almost disappointed, and that was what made Vivienne's mask crack even further. Vivienne, he said, his voice dropping slightly, the way a father would speak to a child who had just ruined something irreparable. That's enough. A shift, a subtle one, but Jaden felt it. And so did Vivienne. Enough? She repeated, the disbelief now etched into her features. Enough? Her laugh was humorless, almost shaky. She turned, looking at the officers, at the restaurant full of people who were no longer as certain of her, innocents as they had been 10 minutes ago. Jaden could see it in their expressions, the doubt creeping in. Some of them looked at her, then at Elijah, then at the untouched bowl of soup now being sealed away for testing. And they were thinking, questioning. And Vivienne knew it. Fine, she finally hissed, shaking her head as she crossed her arms. Over her chest, her nails digging into her skin so hard they might have drawn blood. Fine, test it. But when this all turns out to be nothing, I want an apology. From both of you. She turned to Jaden with a sneer. And I want this little rat dragged out of here in handcuffs. Jaden clenched his fists, his stomach twisted with the lingering weight of uncertainty. Because what if she was right? What if there wasn't anything in the soup? What if he had imagined it? What if this was all some elaborate mistake and he had just ruined his only chance to be heard? But he couldn't be wrong. He had seen her. He had seen the vial, had seen the way she poured the liquid into the soup, had seen the gleam of satisfaction in her eyes when she had stirred it in, as if it were nothing, as if murder were nothing, and he wasn't about to let her get away with it. He couldn't. Elijah exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face before turning back to the officer. "How long?" he asked, his voice void of emotion. The officer pursed his lips. "A few hours, maybe. We'll have a full analysis done. If there's anything in it, we'll know." "And if there isn't?" Vivienne cut in sharply. "If there isn't?" the officer said, leveling her with a look. "Then you'll be free to go." Vivienne lifted her chin slightly, her confidence barely hanging on by a thread. "Good." And then she turned her attention back to Elijah, narrowing her gaze in a way that sent a chill straight down Jaden's spine. "I hope you're ready to feel really, really stupid." Elijah didn't respond. He didn't need to, because the truth was coming, whether she liked it or not. The minutes stretched unbearably as the police officers secured the bowl of soup, sealing it in a plastic evidence bag before swiftly exiting the restaurant, leaving behind an atmosphere so thick with tension that it felt like the very air had turned to stone. Jaden's breath came in short, uneven bursts, his fingers twitching at his sides as he watched Vivienne. She was still standing, rigid and composed, her arms crossed over her chest in a perfect display of controlled fury. But her eyes told a different story. There was a flicker of something wild beneath that cold veneer, something calculating, predatory. She wasn't done yet. She was waiting, searching for the next move to regain control of the situation. And then she found it. Her gaze snapped to Jaden and her lips curled into something between amusement and disgust, her voice deceptively soft but edged with venom. "You know," she mused, tilting her head slightly. "I don't think you've really thought this through, have you?" Jaden stiffened, his stomach twisting at the sharpness in her tone. "You're so sure of yourself," she continued, her voice dropping lower, forcing the room to lean in, to listen. "So certain that what you saw was real. But what if it wasn't?" She let out a soft, humorless chuckle, shaking her head. "What if you imagined it? What if you're just another lost little street kid, so desperate for a moment of importance that you convinced yourself you were some kind of hero?" Jaden's fists clenched at his sides, his pulse hammering in his ears. She was trying to break him. He knew this game. He had lived it his whole life. People like her didn't fight with fists, they fought with words, with doubt, with the kind of psychological warfare that made you question your own reality. He had seen it happen before, had watched kids like him be torn down until they weren't sure of anything anymore, but he wouldn't fall for it. Not this time. "I know what I saw," he said firmly, forcing the shake out of his voice. But Vivienne only smiled, slow and cruel, stepping closer. "Do you?" she whispered, her voice so quiet only he could hear. "Because if you're wrong, if that test comes back clean, what do you think happens to you?" Jaden's breath hitched. His stomach churned. "I'll tell you what happens," she murmured so casually it sent an eerie chill down his spine. "You'll be arrested for trespassing, for harassment, maybe even for slander. And you? A homeless black boy. In this city? Do you really think anyone will care what happens to you?" She let the words sink in, let them twist in his mind like a knife carving into his ribs. Jaden wanted to speak, wanted to fight back, but his mouth had gone dry. His thoughts were spiraling, his confidence slipping under the weight of her words. What if she was right? What if he was wrong? The restaurant was too quiet, the weight of expectation, of disbelief, of judgment pressed against him from all sides. He could feel their eyes on him, waiting, deciding, doubting. Even Elijah, who had been the only one to listen, was watching him now, his expression unreadable. What if the test came back clean? What if he had just destroyed himself for nothing? And then, the sound of the restaurant doors bursting open snapped the room back to life. The officer returned, his face tight, unreadable as he strode toward Elijah with swift, measured steps. Jaden's heart stopped. This was it, the moment of truth, the moment everything hinged on. The entire restaurant seemed to be holding its breath. The officer reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a folded document, and handed it directly to Elijah. "Sir, he said evenly. The results came back. A pause, a heartbeat, and then the soup tested positive for poison. The word slammed into the room like a wrecking ball. Gasps erupted. A fork clattered against a plate. Someone cursed under their breath. And Vivienne didn't move. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe. For the first time, the perfect mask shattered completely. What? The word barely left her lips. A whisper. A rasp of disbelief. Elijah's hands tightened around the paper in his hands, his fingers curling with undeniable fury. He slowly lifted his gaze to his wife, his expression so calm, so controlled, it was terrifying. You poisoned my food. Vivienne's breath hitched. Elijah, you poisoned my food. Each word was razor sharp, cutting through the false reality she had tried so hard to maintain. The police officer took a step forward, his voice now clipped and authoritative. Mrs. Carter, he said, reaching for the cuffs at his belt. You are under arrest for attempted murder. And that was when Vivienne snapped. She lunged, not at Elijah, at Jaden. A snarl ripped from her lips as she moved with terrifying speed, her manicured nails slashing through the air toward his face. But Jaden, despite the sheer shock of it, moved on instinct. He ducked, barely. A split second later, the Jew officers tackled her, slamming her against the table, pinning her arms behind her back as she screamed, thrashed, cursed. I deserved everything he had, she shrieked, her voice cracking with something raw and monstrous. He was supposed to die. But no one was listening anymore. The cuffs snapped around her wrists. The restaurant remained frozen, stunned, shaken. Jaden just stood there, heart pounding, hands shaking, watching as the woman who had tried to kill her own husband was dragged away, her designer dress wrinkled, her hair a mess, her screams echoing into nothing. And then, for the first time since it had all begun, Elijah turned to Jaden. He looked at him, really looked at him. His eyes, once filled with skepticism and suspicion, were now filled with something else. Understanding, gratitude, respect. The weight of everything hit Jaden all at once. He had done it. He had stopped her. He had saved a life. But as the chaos settled, a different question began to creep into his mind, one that sent a shiver down his spine. If Vivienne was willing to do this, had she done it before? Had someone else not been as lucky? And was there someone else out there, someone just like him, who might have seen something they weren't supposed to see? Comment number 1 if you think justice was served, but do you think this is really over? Or is there something even darker lurking beneath the surface? Like, subscribe, and stay tuned, because the next revelation might change everything. The restaurant remained frozen in the aftermath of Vivienne's arrest, the echoes of her screams still lingering in the stunned silence. The officers had hauled her out in handcuffs, her hair disheveled, her expensive dress wrinkled, and her carefully constructed persona utterly destroyed. But even as the doors swung shut behind them, as the murmurs of the high-class patrons returned in hushed, uneasy waves, the weight of the night's events still pressed down like an unbearable storm that had yet to fully pass. Jaden remained, rooted in place, his breath still uneven, his body still vibrating with the aftershocks of adrenaline. He had done it. He had saved a man's life. But instead of relief washing over him, something colder settled in his stomach. Because he knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't over. Elijah Carter had barely moved since Vivienne had been taken away. He still held the toxicology report in his hands, his grip stiff and unmoving, his sharp gray eyes locked onto the printed words as though he were reading them over and over again, forcing himself to understand. His wife had tried to kill him, had sat across from him, had smiled at him, had stirred his soup as if she had done nothing at all. The betrayal on his face wasn't loud, wasn't explosive. It was something deeper, something that carved into his bones, something that hollowed him out in a way that not even his immense wealth or power could shield him from. But there was something else in his expression too, a slow, creeping realization, a sickening suspicion that curled its way into his mind like a parasite he couldn't shake. He exhaled, slow and measured, before finally lifting his gaze to Jaden. She was too calm, he murmured, his voice so soft it barely carried across the table. Jaden blinked, his body still locked in fight-or-flight mode, unsure if Elijah was speaking to him or simply thinking aloud. She wasn't shocked when the police showed up, Elijah continued, his voice darkening with each word, each thought. She wasn't surprised when the soup tested positive. She tried to talk her way out of it, but she wasn't scared, not until she knew she had lost. He set the paper down on the table, pushing it aside like something filthy. Because she had done it before. Jaden stiffened. He didn't want to believe it. He didn't want to imagine how many other times Vivienne had poisoned a meal, how many times she had sat across from someone, smiling, laughing, making pleasant conversation, all while they unknowingly swallowed their own deaths. The thought made his stomach churn, made something deep and primal twist inside him. Because what if tonight hadn't been the first time? What if Elijah hadn't been her first target? How long? Elijah asked suddenly, his voice sharp now. Direct, cutting through the fog in Jaden's mind. How long were you outside before you saw her? Jaden hesitated, his throat dry, but he forced himself to answer. A while, he admitted, shifting on his feet. I was looking for food, I was just watching. Elijah's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. Did you see her before that? Jaden frowned. Before? Before she sat down with me, Elijah clarified, his voice eerily steady. Did you see her talk to anyone? Did you see her meet with someone else? Jaden opened his mouth, ready to say no, ready to swear that he had only seen her that one time, but then he stopped. His breath caught in his throat, because he did remember something. Something small, something insignificant at the time. But now it sent ice slithering through his veins. He had seen her. Before. She had stepped out of a black town car, in front of the restaurant. She had been alone, but she hadn't gone inside right away. She had stopped just outside the entrance, her gaze flickering toward a man standing by the fountain. He had been older, dressed in a tailored navy suit, his silver hair combed back in perfect precision. Jaden had barely paid attention at the time, had dismissed it as nothing more than two rich people exchanging pleasantries. But now, the memory sharpened. He remembered the way the man had leaned in slightly, the way Vivienne had slid something into his hand. It had been quick, discreet, not a handshake, not a greeting, a transaction. And then the man had left. Jaden's stomach twisted. Who had that man been? And more importantly, what had Vivienne given him? He looked up at Elijah, whose expression had darkened even further. There was someone else, Jaden admitted slowly, his voice quieter now, more uncertain. Before she sat down with you, she met someone, an older guy. They didn't talk long, but she gave him something. Elijah's jaw clenched. Describe him. Jaden did his best. The navy suit, the silver hair, the careful way he had moved, like a man who didn't do anything without purpose. Elijah's expression barely changed, but the tension in his shoulders increased, the air around him seeming to grow heavier. He knew who it was. Jaden could see it in his eyes. Who is he? Jaden asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elijah exhaled slowly, shaking his head. If it's who I think it is, he muttered, then this is bigger than just her. He turned away slightly, reaching into his coat pocket, pulling out his sleek black phone, his fingers moving swiftly across the screen as he sent off a message. Jaden's heart hammered in his chest. What did that mean? Bigger than just her? Had she been working with someone else? Was she just a pawn in something even darker? The questions swirled violently in his mind, each one more terrifying than the last. But one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And if they didn't figure out the truth soon, someone else was going to die. Elijah's fingers hovered over his phone screen for a moment before he hit send, his face carved from stone, his expression unreadable, as the weight of what Jaden had just told him settled deep into his bones. The realization that Vivienne had met with someone else just before their dinner wasn't just a new piece of the puzzle. It was confirmation that this attempted murder had been planned far beyond what he had initially imagined. This wasn't just about a bitter wife looking to kill her husband for his fortune. This was bigger. The police had already taken Vivienne away, but Elijah knew this was far from over. Jaden could see it in his face, the way his eyes flickered, with something far more dangerous than anger. Determination, calculation, a realization that this wasn't just a betrayal but a conspiracy. The weight of the moment pressed down on them both, suffocating and unrelenting. The restaurant was no longer watching them as closely. The spectacle of Vivienne's arrest had rattled the guests enough that conversations had shifted to hurried whispers and phone calls. Some guests had already left, clearly eager to distance themselves from the scandal, while others lingered, pretending to be disinterested but failing miserably. But Jaden wasn't thinking about them. He was thinking about the man in the navy suit. The memory sharpened in his mind. He could still see the way Vivienne had moved when she handed the man something, the way their exchange had been quick, practiced. This wasn't the first time they had done this. This wasn't a spontaneous act of desperation. This was coordinated. Elijah exhaled slowly, slipping his phone back into his pocket before finally turning his full attention to Jaden, his sharp gray eyes pinning him in place with an intensity that sent a shiver down the boy's spine. "You said she gave him something," Elijah murmured, his voice calm but carrying the weight of something much heavier beneath the surface. "You're sure?" Jaden swallowed hard but nodded. "I didn't think much of it at first," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But now—" Elijah's jaw clenched. It was worse than he thought. If Vivienne had accomplices, if there were more people involved in this, then the danger hadn't ended when the police took her away. It had only just begun, and that meant Jaden was in far more trouble than he realized. "That man you saw," Elijah continued, his tone deliberate now, methodical. "What did he look like? Every detail you remember?" Jaden hesitated, his mind scrambling to recall everything. "Older," he said after a moment. "Maybe in his 60s. Silver hair, really neat, looked expensive, like the way he walked, the way he carried himself. Navy suit, I think. He was tall but not super big, just like he was used to being in charge." Elijah's expression didn't change, but Jaden could see something dark pass behind his eyes. Recognition, understanding, a connection. And then Elijah sighed, not in relief, not in exhaustion, in knowing. "I know who he is," Elijah muttered more to himself than to Jaden before rubbing a hand over his face, his fingers lingering for a moment as though trying to push away the weight of what he now understood. Jaden's chest tightened. "Who is he?" Elijah didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned away slightly, reaching for his untouched glass of water, swirling it absently as he gathered his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, quieter, but filled with something dangerous. "His name is Richard Langford," Elijah said finally. And just the name itself felt heavy, like it carried its own gravity. "He's a power broker. Not in the political sense, not in the financial sense. In the way that actually matters." Jaden frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "What does that mean?" Elijah's lips pressed into a thin line. "It means he makes things happen, or it makes people disappear." Jaden's stomach twisted. He wasn't naive. He had spent enough time on the streets to know that people with power, real power, operated in ways that most people never saw. But hearing it out loud, hearing Elijah confirm that this wasn't just a simple case of a wife trying to kill her husband, but something more, something calculated, something backed by people who knew how to hide their crimes, made his hands tremble slightly. He clenched them into fists to stop the shaking. "So," Jaden hesitated, licking his dry lips, "if she was working with him, does that mean—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Elijah exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the glass. It means she wasn't acting alone. The words felt like a cold punch to the gut, because that meant whoever Vivienne was working with, they were still out there, still watching, still moving, and if Richard Langford was involved, then Vivienne's arrest wouldn't stop anything. They would just find someone else to finish the job, and that meant Elijah's life was still in danger. And worse, so was Jaden's. The realization hit both of them at the same time. Elijah's expression darkened, his mind already working through the next steps, already trying to calculate the moves ahead. But Jaden felt a different kind of fear creeping up his spine, because he was just a kid who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, a kid who had seen too much, a kid who was now, whether he wanted to be or not, part of something far bigger than himself. And people like Richard Langford, they didn't leave loose ends. Elijah knew it, Jaden knew it, and for the first time, the reality of what he had done, not just stopping Vivienne, not just saving Elijah, but exposing something much bigger, something that had been meant to stay hidden, began to fully sink in. He wasn't safe. Not yet. And neither was Elijah. "We need to leave," Elijah said abruptly, standing so suddenly that the motion startled Jaden out of his thoughts. "Now," Jaden blinked. "What? If Langford was involved, then he already knows the plan failed." Elijah said, his voice low and sharp, his movements deliberate as he reached for his coat, which means he's either cutting his losses or he's sending someone to clean up the mess. The words sent a cold shiver down Jaden's spine. Clean up the mess. He knew what that meant. It meant they were going to kill him. Elijah turned to Jaden, his gaze unreadable, but there was something new in it now. A silent decision. A shift. "Come with me," he said simply. "I'll keep you safe." Jaden hesitated for only a second. Then he nodded, because he knew deep down that staying here, staying alone, it wasn't an option anymore, because this wasn't over. Not yet. And if Langford was still out there, watching, waiting, deciding his next move, then the real danger was just beginning. Comment number 1 if you think Elijah is right to take Jaden with him. But do you think they'll make it out in time? Or is Langford already one step ahead? Like, subscribe, and stay tuned, because the next move could mean life or death. Jaden followed Elijah out of the restaurant, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might explode. The cold night air hit him like a slap, but it did nothing to calm the storm inside him. Every nerve in his body screamed that something was wrong, that they were being watched, that any second now someone would step out of the shadows and finish what Vivienne had started. Elijah didn't speak as he led Jaden down the sidewalk, his long strides purposeful, his phone pressed tightly to his ear as he murmured into it. Jaden couldn't hear what he was saying, but he didn't need to. He could see it in Elijah's face, the tension in his jaw, the barely contained rage simmering beneath the surface. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was planning. Jaden had spent his whole life on the streets learning to read people, learning to recognize when someone was dangerous, when someone was unpredictable, when someone was about to snap. But Elijah wasn't unpredictable. He was controlled, calculated. He wasn't panicking, but Jaden could feel the shift in him, the way his entire demeanor had changed the moment he realized Vivienne wasn't working alone. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about something else. Revenge. Elijah ended his call and glanced around before signaling to a sleek black car idling at the curb. The driver, a man in his 40s with an impassive face, stepped out and opened the door without a word. "Get in," Elijah ordered. Jaden hesitated only for a second before slipping into the back seat. The door shut behind them with a soft click, sealing them in. The car smelled like leather and expensive cologne, a stark contrast to the filth and gasoline stench Jaden was used to. It felt too clean, too foreign, too much like a world he didn't belong in. But he didn't have a choice. Not anymore. Elijah sat beside him, still silent, his fingers tapping against his knee in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows as they pulled away from the restaurant, but Jaden barely noticed. His mind was racing, trying to piece everything together, trying to figure out where this was all heading. "Where are we going?" Jaden finally asked, his voice hoarse. Elijah didn't answer immediately. He exhaled through his nose, glancing at Jaden before turning his attention back to the window. "Somewhere safe," he said eventually. "For now." Jaden swallowed hard. "For now." That didn't sound reassuring. That sounded like this wasn't over. That sounded like this was only just beginning. The car weaved through the city, taking turns Jaden didn't recognize, slipping into quieter streets, leaving behind the polished, glittering skyline of wealth and power. Eventually, they stopped in front of a building that looked nothing like the kind of place a billionaire would call home. It was discreet, the kind of place you wouldn't look twice at if you passed it. On the street, no doorman, no fancy entrance, just a nondescript black door and a single security camera blinking above it. Elijah got out first, motioning for Jaden to follow. The driver remained in the car, not even sparing them a glance as he pulled away the moment the door shut behind them. Jaden's gut twisted. Where were they? Elijah pressed a code into the keypad beside the door, and a quiet beep sounded before the lock clicked open. He pushed inside, and Jaden followed, stepping into a dimly lit hallway that smelled like old wood and something faintly metallic. It wasn't a home. It was a safe house. The realization settled deep in his bones. This wasn't just some temporary hideout. This was a place for people who needed to disappear. "Sit," Elijah said, motioning toward the worn leather couch. In the center of the room, Jaden sat, his muscles still tense, his hands balled into fists in his lap. Elijah moved toward the bar cart in the corner, pouring himself a drink, but he didn't touch it. Instead, he turned, his gaze locking onto Jaden with an intensity that made the boy's breath catch. "Tell me everything you remember about that man," Elijah said. Jaden frowned. "I already told you." "Everything," Elijah cut him off, his voice sharper now. Not just what he looked like, how he moved, how he talked. The way he looked at Vivienne, every single detail. Jaden hesitated, but he forced himself to think. He closed his eyes, trying to picture the man again. "He was confident," Jaden said slowly. "Not in a flashy way, not like a rich guy, trying to show off. More like he knew he was untouchable, like nothing could touch him." Elijah didn't react, but something in his posture shifted. "And Vivienne?" Jaden continued, his voice quieter now. "She wasn't in control. When she talked to him, she acts like she's the smartest person in the room, but with him, she was different, nervous, like she knew she had to impress him. That got a reaction." Elijah's jaw ticked, his fingers tightening around the edge of the bar cart. He nodded once, as if Jaden had just confirmed something he already suspected. "Langford wasn't just involved," Elijah murmured. "He was running it." Jaden swallowed hard. "So what do we do?" Elijah exhaled slowly, dragging a hand down his face before straightening. "We?" he echoed, raising a brow. "You're not involved in this, kid." "You did your part," Jaden bristled. "The hell I'm not. I'm the reason you're still alive." Elijah studied him for a long moment, then let out a low, humorless chuckle. "Yeah," he muttered. "You are." There was something unreadable in his expression, something that almost looked like respect. But there was something else there, too. Something darker, guilt, because Jaden might have saved his life, but in doing so, he had painted a target on his own back, and Elijah knew it. He turned away, pulling his phone out again, scrolling through his contacts. "I can get you out of the city," he said, his voice neutral. "Somewhere far, somewhere Langford can't reach you." Jaden frowned. "And what about you?" Elijah smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I have my own plans." Jaden hesitated. He didn't like it. He didn't like the way Elijah was talking, like he had already decided how this was going to end, like he had already accepted what he had to do. "You're going after him," Jaden realized. Elijah didn't deny it. He just took a slow sip of his drink. Langford doesn't leave loose ends, he said, and neither do I. Jaden's pulse quickened. That's suicide. Elijah shrugged. Maybe. Silence stretched between them. Jaden clenched his fists, his mind racing. He should leave. He should take whatever help Elijah was offering and disappear, just like he had always done. But something deep in his gut told him that if he walked away now, he would regret it for the rest of his life. Because Elijah wasn't just planning revenge, he was planning war, and Jaden had already chosen a side. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jaden exhaled. I'm staying. Elijah studied him for a long moment before nodding once. All right, kid, he said. Let's end this. And just like that, the course of both their lives was set. No turning back, no second chances, just two survivors stepping into the fire together, ready to finish what had been started. Because this wasn't just about justice anymore. This was about making sure Langford never got another chance to hurt anyone else again. The weight of everything that had happened sat heavy on Jaden's shoulders as he looked out over the dimly lit city skyline. The events of the last few hours had changed everything. Just yesterday, he had been just another homeless kid, invisible to the world, fighting for scraps, ignored and dismissed by people who never even glanced in his direction. And yet somehow, against all odds, he had stopped a murder. Not just any murder, but one planned by a woman with power, influence, and connections to something even more sinister. He had saved Elijah Carter's life, and in doing so, he had uncovered something much bigger than himself. Vivienne had been taken away in handcuffs, but she was just one piece of the puzzle. Elijah had known from the moment he saw the truth in Jaden's eyes that his wife had never acted alone. And now, after hearing about Richard Langford, after piecing together the subtle hints, the unspoken alliances, and the quiet, calculated moves, he understood the depth of the conspiracy he had just barely escaped. This wasn't about one attempted murder. It was about power, corruption, control, and the people who pulled the strings from behind the curtain weren't going to stop just because one of their pawns had been caught. But the question remained, what now? For Jaden, the choice was already made. He had spent his entire life being overlooked, being told he didn't belong, being pushed into the shadows by a society that had already decided his fate before he had ever been given a chance. But now he had a chance to fight back. He had already proven that he wasn't just a scared kid struggling to survive. He had stood up for what was right, even when the odds were against him. And he wasn't going to stop now. For Elijah, the choice was harder. He had spent decades building his empire, securing his wealth, ensuring that nothing could touch him. He had believed that money was the ultimate shield, that power protected those who wielded it well. But tonight, he had learned something chilling. The people he thought he controlled were, in fact, controlling him. They had decided his fate. Behind his back, they had written him off as collateral damage. And if Vivienne had succeeded, no one would have asked questions. No one would have searched for the truth. The headlines would have painted a tragic accident, a billionaire's untimely demise, and life would have moved on. But Jaden had changed that. Jaden had saved him. And now, Elijah had to decide what to do with that knowledge. He could walk away, try to rebuild, try to pretend none of this had happened, or he could fight back just like Jaden had. Not for revenge, not just to destroy the people who had betrayed him, but to stop them. Because now he understood what true power really was. It wasn't money. It wasn't influence. It was the ability to stand up when no one else would. And so, two lives that should never have crossed paths had become entangled in something neither of them had ever expected. A homeless boy with nothing, and a billionaire with everything, now standing together in the face of something far more dangerous than either of them had realized. But despite the uncertainty, despite the danger, one truth remained clear. This was only the beginning. What would you have done in Jaden's place? Would you have spoken up knowing no one would believe you? Would you have risked everything to do the right thing, even when the odds were against you? Comment number 1 if you believe standing up for what's right is always worth it. Do you think Elijah and Jaden will succeed in bringing down the people behind this conspiracy? Or are they already in too deep? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because sometimes the smallest actions can change everything. Thank you for watching, and remember, courage doesn't always come from those in power. Sometimes it comes from the ones the world tries to ignore. Stay safe, stay strong, and we'll see you in the next story.